I think it's worth remembering that art, or what we now call art, before it had a name, art is much older than written language. Art might be older than language itself. That is where images are where people began to give shape to ideas and to needs and to fears and to powers over nature, or power that nature had over them, right? And I think a lot of that kind of elemental capacity of art never went away.
Hey, I'm Kate, and this is Replay the Rewind, a podcast about the stories that built our world and people still rewrite it. We take a step back, hit rewind, and look closer. Each week, I talk with people who study history, the ones uncovering what really happened, and people who make it, the ones shaping what happens next. Because history isn't just what's behind us. It's in every decision, every trend, and every movement shaping today. So whether you're someone who loves history or someone who never thought you would, welcome. Hi guys, it's Kate. Welcome to Replay the Rewind. I'm joined by a very, very special guest, Dr. Al Akers, a professor of art history at Georgetown University, whose work focuses on late medieval and Northern Renaissance art, especially artists like Jan van Eyck. This is a time when most people couldn't read, religion was shaped by everyday life, and paintings weren't just decoration, they were how people understood faith, identity, and the world around them. Dr. Akers' research looks at how meaning, symbolism, and even identity are built into images, often through details we don't notice at first. I'm so excited to talk to you today, Dr. Akers. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your schedule to do this.
Thank you, Kate.
I would just like to start us off with, I feel like as a high school student, we study a lot about U.S. history, but I don't know much about, the medieval and Northern Renaissance art. So how did you get into that? Like, what drew you to it?
Great question. And why this kind of art in particular? I kind of backed into it, to be honest with you. When I was a high school student, really what I liked most was making art, painting and drawing. I spent lots and lots of time there. I thought maybe I would go to art school, but I wound up thinking, well, if I'd like to, I'll go to a university and I can be an art major maybe while I'm there. Instead of taking an art class in my first semester, I took an art history class, and then I took another, and I just sort of kept rolling along with art history and didn't take any more art classes. But by the time I had finished an art history major in college, I'd only taken one class in Renaissance art, and it was the Italian Renaissance, which I still love and work on. I had never taken a class on Northern Renaissance, but I did that when I started graduate school a year later. And I happened to take a Northern Renaissance class. And I think even more important than that class was the fact that this was in Philadelphia at the University of Pennsylvania. There is a great art museum there, and there are some particularly great paintings from this period. And I started to work on one of the artists who has a great painting in that museum and never looked back. It turned out to be a place that just totally captivated me.
Wow, that's so interesting. When you were at graduate school, was it like a certain professor? It was just solely like visiting that museum that really drew you to it?
No, it was the whole thing. It was certainly the museum meant a lot, but my professors did too. I'll confess that when I started graduate school, I didn't really know what I was doing. I had liked being an art history student, and at some point I realized I could keep doing that, and I did. But I started to take a couple of classes that really clicked in deeper ways. I'll name one professor in particular. His name was Leo Steinberg. I didn't know at the time that he was a very famous critic and professor, but the first class I took with him, it was a revelation. I had never heard anybody talk about paintings that way or think about paintings that way. He worked on Renaissance art, but he also worked on modern art, contemporary art, and I like that too, that kind of connectedness of different periods. So it was the whole thing. And to be honest with you, it was also starting to teach as a TA in my second year of graduate school. I've often said the only thing I was sure about when I started graduate school was that I did not want to be a teacher. I couldn't imagine being a teacher, a professor. So I thought maybe I'd be a curator or something like that. But they told me they wanted me to do some TA work. And it turned out to be totally fascinating and kind of fun.
Wow, that's so, so interesting. I feel like a lot of people, especially my age, are maybe not first drawn to the Renaissance time period. Is there a particular piece or detail that you've studied that you think has helped you feel more connected, or helps other people feel more connected to that time period?
That's a great question. Yes. Yeah. So lots of them. But there is one that really, to your question very specifically, that stands out above all the rest, I would say. In your introduction, you mentioned an artist named Jan van Eyck, who I've worked on quite a bit. Yeah. And he, maybe his most famous painting in modern times is, it's a painting that's in London now. It's of a man and a woman, a married couple standing in their home. It's called the Arnolfini portrait. We know their name. But one of the really remarkable things about it is how many different ways the painting really tries to connect with anybody looking at it. Not just them, the people who owned it, but there's several things about it that really sort of reach out to whoever is standing here looking back in. For example, right in the foreground of the painting, front and center, is their little dog, is looking up at you, doing exactly what any dog does when you walk into a room. When somebody walks into a room, the dog is going to see and is going to perk up a little bit. So you can kind of feel that. It doesn't matter that we're 600 years after the fact when this was painted. This was painted in the 1430s. But even more amazing than that is what the artist put in the middle of the painting on the wall of these people's home. There's a mirror on the wall. And when you get very close, you see the backs of those two people who are looking at you, the people who own this painting. That's kind of amazing to see the backs of them in a mirror. But if you look even closer, in between them in the mirror, there are two more people. And they're just barely a couple of strokes of paint each, but you know they're people. They're not in the painting. They're out here where we are. So people assume that one of those must be the painter, standing here looking at them as if while painting them, and the other person could be anybody. In a way, the other person is kind of us. So he found a way to paint portraits of us. They paid him for the portrait. They were his clients, but he in a way, he managed to include everybody who looks at this painting standing next to him, admiring his work. So your question was about how to feel connected. That's a really special example of how artists, even then, were thinking about how to do exactly that across time, across the ages.
Yeah. Wow, that's really, really cool. I feel like, so as being a professor, you've obviously taught many different types of students from many different backgrounds. Have you noticed any shifts in how students engage with art compared to when you first started teaching?
Lots of shifts. Yeah. And they matter a lot. They matter a lot. So when I studied art, my access was mainly through whatever pictures were in the books we were using, the textbooks we were using. And then in the classroom, the professor was using slides. And this was the case when I began teaching as well. Slides, I think people still know what they are, young people, right?
Yeah.
The little plastic squares that you project light through. But you either had them or you didn't, and you were kind of at the mercy of whatever quality they were. So in those early days for me, a lot of the images of works of art that we studied were black and white photographs of works of art, or it was a slide that maybe had kind of gone pink over the years. The color was distorted. Or that day when I'm teaching a class about this artist or that artist, it might be that slide in the university's collection was missing or somebody else had it, so I couldn't use it. So now we all have access to all of it literally at our fingertips and in our pockets. What feels like the entire history of art or something close to it, at least all of the best known work from around the world. That's amazing. It's also, I think in some ways a little bit, I don't want to say dangerous, but it can kind of distort things because having things that easily available to you, all of those different kinds of arts from different places, all of them the same size, all of them rectangles in your hand. You can jump from ancient Greece to contemporary New York and everything in between. it kind of smooths it all out and blurs it and makes it all seem a little bit the same. So one of the things that everybody tries to do, hopes to do, is to get ourselves back a little bit closer toward their origins and toward the fact that these are physical things in physical places that live in particular moments. And I think there are new kinds of challenges in trying to do that when all of us have such easy access to pictures of works of art.
That's a really great point. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but symbolism and interpretation are, I think, a major part of your research. Can you maybe share an example where noticing a subtle detail in the artwork changed your understanding of that piece or the era that it came from?
For my research in particular, my writing in particular, that's really very close to the heart of what I do. Thinking about small decisions, what seem like small decisions that artists have made that can be very revealing about much larger ideas at work. So one that I think of is a painting of the Madonna and Child, a painter named Roger van der Weyden. He's from the same part of the world, from what is now Belgium. The Madonna has the Christ child in her lap. He's holding a book, an open book. The basic idea was really very familiar. But what I noticed is that the book that he's holding, he's not just playing with it. It had, in fact, often been referred to in the scholarship as him kind of playing with this valuable book like a naughty child. When I looked a little bit more closely, it was very clear to me that he's not messing up the pages, that he's actually paging backwards toward the beginning of the book. But I think that's probably a way of suggesting that the Christ child, or Christ himself, is referring back to the beginning of the Bible, that he's pointing back toward what came to be called the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible, which Christians had come to read as prefiguration, anticipation of him as the Messiah, right? Prophecies of Christ. So there are different layers to it, but that would be an incredibly subtle way in what looks like just a detail of a playful baby, of really deep theology being put into a picture in the texture of reality that's very familiar to anybody. So that was something that opened up lots of other ideas. It opened up ideas about how that artist thinks about text in his paintings, which I wrote something about, and also about how he thinks about time in paintings, which is something else that I've worked quite a bit on, how time gets represented and sort of shaped in paintings. It completely changed my sense of that painting, which had previously seemed to me like a beautiful painting, but not especially revealing, not especially open to interpretation. And I try to be careful about that. In my field, it's possible to overdo it. But this seems, as I say, to open up a lot and to connect in different ways, not just in that painting, but in almost everything that this artist produced. So I wrote a lot about those sorts of things, and that was kind of a key piece for me. I should say, too, though, I had looked at that painting many times in books and reproductions. I had read about it. I felt like I knew it pretty well. But the first time I spent time with the painting itself in Madrid, which is where it happens to be, that was the first time I realized what was happening in that book. I had looked at reproductions of it many times, but only in the flesh did I see and saw pretty quickly what he was doing. And that's often the case. Seeing a work of art in person is completely different from seeing it in reproduction.
One idea behind my podcast is to really explore how the past still shapes the present. And I feel like, studying art history really relates to that. In your view, how does it help people better understand the world that we're living in now? Has there ever been a particular art piece that has really connected the past to the present, or helped you understand the present more?
Yes, I think it shapes how I see the world every day, and in all kinds, more than I consciously think about sometimes. So I think it's worth remembering that art, or what we now call art, before it had a name, art is much older than written language. Art might be older than language itself. That is where images are where people began to give shape to ideas and to needs and to fears and to powers over nature or power that nature had over them, right? And I think a lot of that kind of elemental capacity of art never went away. And I think it has only multiplied over the centuries, over the millennia since then. So, for example, if we only had text, if we only had scrolls with writings about ancient Egypt, about politics and religion and burial practices of ancient Egypt, that would tell us a lot. That would be incredibly valuable. But none of it would have conveyed what the pyramids can convey or what sculpture from ancient Egypt can convey. Right? Those are forms that don't really have parallel in text or in language. They collaborate with it. There's a kind of there's a conversation, of course, between images and forms and language, but it's irreplaceable, right? And you're asking about how it can shape the way we think about our own world today. You can bring it very close to home. Everyone knows. You and I are both in Washington right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There's tons of very traditional-looking architecture in the federal center of Washington, D.C., right? Huge columns and domes and pediments and marble facades, right? And you can love it or you can hate it or you can not particularly care about it. But it really is extraordinary when you start to understand why that style, why that vocabulary from 2,000 years ago, from ancient Greece and Rome, came to be adopted as a vocabulary of authority, of official authority. In some contexts, people understand it as conveying rationality and harmony and stability. And in some others, it's more concerning. Some people regard various formulations of that as being about control, for example. In fact, it all became very political again this year. The current administration issued an executive order back in January to the effect that this is to be the official federal language of architecture going forward for new projects. That's really something.
Wow. So because of that, it obviously caused, conflict, right? So do you think that, bringing back art from the past can cause conflicting conversations about what it meant, or because it connects back to the present, would it cause more conflict?
It can.
Yeah.
It can. The past and past art, I think, it's never dead. It's just, I was going to say it's just asleep. I'm not even sure it's asleep. It is always coming back. It's always being brought back. And not, of course, not just by art historians. Art historians are the least of it. What's more often consequential is, for example, the what I just mentioned, when governments take charge of images, when governments reshape images or forms to suit their own needs, right? To try to persuade. In many ways, since time immemorial, art has often been about persuading people of things.
Right.
To fortify beliefs or undo beliefs, things like that. So there's plenty of that. It won't stop. No one's ever going to find and fix the exact intended original meaning of those things and say that's it. So art is a voice of societies. It's an instrument. It's not just a mirror of what happened in other ways. It shaped what happened. It shaped their own beliefs. And it can become a weapon too, just as it can become an instrument.
Those are great points. Is it hard to sometimes figure out if that art piece portrays propaganda just because that time period was so long ago, or is it pretty easy to understand or decipher?
All depends, right? Depends on the individual work, depends on the society we're talking about, and how well we do or don't understand the larger context of that society. I suppose it also hinges on how exactly you want to define propaganda, right? I
Right.
was suggesting that lots of work has always been about persuading. Well,
Hmm.
when does persuasion sort of tip into propaganda? That might be that'll often be about who's telling the story. Part of what I teach about is in the same period I teach about includes the 16th century, the time of the Protestant Reformation, when there was an explosion of new kinds of imagery, sort of ignited by this powerful new movement about the faith itself, about Christianity itself, which became really a supercharged debate, is putting it mildly, between what's true and what's not true, and what is correct in the eyes of God. So printed images, which could be, printing was relatively new. Printed images, which could be made inexpensively and disseminated to try to convince lots and lots of people of the same idea. Very often in modern times, when people write the history of propaganda, sort of mass propaganda, they point to that as a key episode when a replicated image could be used to make people get on board, right? Something
Hmm.
we recognize all too well today in
Yeah.
other media.
Yeah. So like going off of that, because studying art involves so much of like a visual analysis, historical context, and like personal interpretation. When you begin studying a new artwork, what are your steps? Like, where do you usually start? Do you go to the image itself, the context for a specific question you want to answer, and like, what do you do after?
Um, for me, it's almost always the image first. It begins with really close looking and thinking about all of the decisions that went into making a picture or a sculpture or a building or a city plan or whatever the case might be. Because it's a little bit too easy for us to think of all of these incredible things that we can see, that we can look back on, and to think of them as just existing. But they didn't just exist. They were made, and the process of making them is just full of thought. And that's what's most captivating to me. So I look at paintings, for example, a lot in the same way that I read literature or read poetry, that you're really thinking along with another mind or several other minds that were responsible for making something. Sometimes it's the artist, sometimes it's a group of artists, sometimes it's the artist working for somebody who's saying, I need this, I want it to accomplish this or that. And there's a back and forth. So that's what's interesting to me. I always think outward from individual works. My research works that way. My teaching works that way. We look closely inside the work and then outward from there into other kinds of connections.
Have you ever had an artwork that you like couldn't decipher, you couldn't understand? And when you can't understand it, what do you do in that situation? Do you usually like try to not look it up online, or like is that like your last resort, or what do you usually do?
I think the key word there is understand. I don't think and I know not all works were meant to have a single meaning. And one of the things that has become especially important in the eyes, not just of art history, but the humanities more generally in the last half century or so, is a deeper and deeper recognition that meaning is something that changes. And meaning was rarely completely fixed and clear, even in the moment when something was first created. So having said that, we do try to go back and to reconstruct the historical moment and to understand what might have made sense, what they were probably trying to do with this or that. Sometimes we can't. That usually happens when it's a work of art that just doesn't fit any mold. It doesn't fit any pattern. Sometimes we just can't even name the subject matter. I don't worry too much when meaning isn't clear. Sometimes I think that's programmed in.
I think like also art history is sometimes very hard to understand for people that are maybe not experts at it. So what are your strategies that you find most effective for helping your students engage with artwork that might be unfamiliar or challenging at first glance do you give away what the deep meaning is, or do you try to let them figure it out themselves?
It's such an interesting phrase, give it away, as if there's kind of a secret they have to get to. But I understand exactly what you're saying. Sometimes you do. So talking specifically about teaching, sometimes you do hold it back a little bit, not just because, I suppose the main idea would be that making the effort to understand, stumbling your way toward understanding is much more useful, can be much more useful than just being told, here's the answer, and move on from there. But it's also, if you leave some space and time for students and other people to think their way toward it, they're gonna recognize possibilities that I haven't and other scholars haven't, right? There really are fresh observations surprisingly often in those kinds of circumstances. I often think that when we're starting to talk about some new major work of art, new to us in the class, I think more often than not, I don't begin with a big claim about what exactly it means and why it's important. I think it's more useful to start with some specific observations, right? Coming back to this idea of looking closely, thinking about details, and thinking about those decisions. Yes, this is, for example, a painting of the Annunciation to Mary, very, very common Renaissance subject. But done in a million different ways. So why did this artist choose to put it in a garden? And why does the angel have rainbow wings? Or why is that statue over there? Right? Those decisions start to move you toward what the original intentions and location and functions of a work might have been. Specific observations.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. It kind of reminds me of my English class, where we have my English class lets us kind of figure out what the text is saying. So that's an interesting way to go about art. Obviously, the Renaissance was a major moment of artistic and cultural change. If you could witness any moment or development from that period firsthand, or any time period that you've studied firsthand, which would it be, and what would you hope to observe? Or if you would want to step into any painting and be in that moment, which one would it be?
I don't know if I'm going to take the bait on that last one about stepping into a painting. I may come back if I think of one.
Yeah.
I think what I would not choose to do, if we're talking about a time machine here, I think what I would not program it for is a famous event. I don't think I want to see a war or a revolution or a discovery or a eureka moment or an assassin, anything that's famous in history, because I feel like I know enough about those turning points that I don't need to see the thing itself. I think what's more intriguing to me and that I'm more curious about are the things that sort of fly under the radar of history, that history doesn't record. So I'd like to be there for some conversations. If I'm sticking with art history, I'd like to be there for a conversation between a great artist and a patron, a client, trying to figure out what kind of work to make and to understand some of the back and forth about those sorts of decisions. A lot of the interpreting we do, we're trying to figure that out. And those are the kinds of things that rarely got written down, even in contracts. We have contracts for works of Renaissance art where they had a written agreement. You're going to deliver it by this date. It's going to have this subject, and I'm going to pay this much, et cetera, et cetera. But they don't usually tell us much about meaning or interpretation the way we like to think about it. So I'd be interested in that. I'd love to watch an artist work, right? So we can imagine watching an artist work might be almost literally, the cliche is watching paint dry, really boring, nothing happening. In fact, we have a famous account of when Leonardo da Vinci was painting his famous Last Supper fresco. in Milan, just before 1500, there was a writer watching him, was hanging around, and said that he'd see Leonardo show up at the crack of dawn and paint all day without eating or drinking until dark. Other days, reports this writer, he would show up and not pick up a paintbrush. He would just stand there and look at it and complain about things that he had painted yesterday or painted before. Or other days he'd show up, he'd come running in, he'd pick up a brush, he'd do a couple of things on one figure and then leave for a few days and not come back. So I'd be interested in knowing a little bit more just about the fabric of their work and the life of making things, which we can't see anymore.
Yeah, because I feel like that would probably, I'm sure, give you more insight on the actual painting itself, right? Yeah.
It would. So one of the other great changes in my fields in the last half century is, to your point about how paintings were made, technology, the technological examination of paintings is unbelievable. With chemical analysis, with X-ray analysis, with other kinds of imaging, we know things about the evolution of paintings, about decisions and materials and processes that we never could have imagined knowing before. We can see underdrawings on a lot of paintings. The first drawing that disappeared under the paint, right? Things we were never supposed to see. So that's incredibly revealing, but it still doesn't give us the whole picture, as it were. Right? It's just glimpses of how it happened.
This was such an amazing conversation. Thank you so much. I truly enjoyed talking to you today. It was so amazing. So thank you so much for being on Replay the Rewind.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Kate. I am so excited about Replay the Rewind.
I know, me too. You're a great first guest. Thank you for joining me.
They'll all be better than me. We're just getting started here, but I think you have a wonderful idea here, and I can't wait to see your next guests.
Thank you. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Kate, and this is Replay the Rewind. Every conversation, every perspective has the same goal: to understand how we got here and where we're headed next. See you next time.